This lecture discusses population ecology, the different interactions and dynamics and processes that affect populations of individual species. This video is just a really neat and beautiful video of starlings in what's called a murmuration, when they get in a huge flock and swirl around in the sky. It looks coordinated, but is essentially just beautiful.
Some important terms. A population is an interbreeding group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same general area. You could add a temporal factor to that too, in the same period of time. So these are individuals of one species that interbreed. They don't breed with other populations outside of the area, typically, and that's how a population is delimited. A community is the assemblage of all the different populations in one area, so all the different species. An ecosystem is when you add the community to the abiotic or non-living physical environment. That makes the ecosystem, the plants and animals and living things, all those different species, and the environment. Populations are important to understand, especially how they work, how they change, and the factors that influence them, to restoration ecology in a number of ways. Usually in restoration we are concerned with a particular species population, but often a community's populations and how they affect each other and how they've been affected by some kind of disturbance, often human disturbance. So knowing the ways that they react to different pressures and changes is important to build into our restoration plan. The density of a population is measured as the number of individuals per unit area. That's pretty clear. It's like any kind of density definition is just that. But dispersion is the way that those species individuals, so the individuals of one particular species, are patterned across the land. How are they spread out and spaced on the land? So 3 different patterns of dispersion, which can be anywhere: air, land, sea. Uniform dispersion, just a kind of stylized example of that, or clumped or random. Let's look at some examples of those. Uniform dispersion is actually pretty interesting because when we come upon it as humans looking at other species, we're always kind of surprised, like, wow, they're so regularly spaced out on the land or the sea, whatever it is, and it surprises us because it looks very regular. But this does happen. Look at the example of penguins. They have kind of equidistance between each other. Same thing happens often with plants. With plants, it's often based on resources or soil moisture or nutrients, or competition for those things too. But this is what it looks like.
This is another example of uniform dispersion or placement. These are creosote bushes and some other ones here in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. And they are dispersed this way mostly because of competition for water. So they need, each plant needs water, and there's not a lot that comes here. So those established shrubs use up all the water in their little area. And if they were closer together, they wouldn't survive because there wouldn't be enough for two. So they're all spaced out in their little zone, and it ends up being a uniform distribution. The salt marsh birdsbeak has a clump distribution in salt marshes like the Carpentria salt marsh and a few others up and down coastal Southern California. And it is found in little areas, almost like small islands that are just at the very high tide, up right above and right at the very highest tide elevations. So they're like almost on little hilltops in the salt marsh that don't get as much or hardly any tidal flow or salty water to them. So that would be an example, a local example of a clustered or clumped distribution. A little background on population dynamics, or how populations grow and change. Some of the characteristics of them are the size of the population. We've already talked about density and dispersion or dispersal. Also, there's immigration of new individuals of that species to that population. There's emigration of the exit of some of the individuals of that population out of the population, births, deaths, and survivorship. Those are all things that characterize a population and how it changes through time. Also, age structure of a population is important to know about. This is something talked about with humans a lot, like how many human males and females and of different age groups are there at any one time. For example, right now, if you took the country of Japan, it has a very older age structure. So there's a lot of older people and not as many younger people. And if you look at other countries, some of the countries that are the developing world, they're flipped. They have a big population of younger people and not a lot of old people. That's called age structure. And it's important with plants and animals and other species of conservation concern too, and in restoration, because we have to have a certain number of reproductive individuals to keep that population healthy and potentially growing. Now let's talk about two population models. Models meaning they're simplified, but they help us understand the ways that populations can grow. One is an exponential model, and another one is a logistic model. So the exponential model of population growth, again, is idealized population in an environment that has unlimited resources. So there's no limits from the resources like space, food, mates, all of those is unlimited. And that gives you a certain kind of starting point to look at population models. The change in the population size during a certain time interval would just equal the births during that time interval minus the deaths. That's the most simple model that we can start with. Adding some more reality to it is the logistic model. So the exponential one you're seeing in red, also called geometric. Again, the population is increasing exponentially, and there's nothing limiting that population. It kind of looks like what human population on Earth has looked like for the last couple hundred years. Logistic growth is a little more realistic for most species, where the population does grow exponentially, has a sigmoidal or S kind of like blue curve, but it starts off slow, then the population rate increases with that sloped part, the steeper slope part of that blue line, and it starts to level off because in the logistic growth model, the resources and density of the population are factored in. So as that population gets more and more dense, the size goes up, it starts to get so dense that that density limits the further growth of it because they're diminishing resources and space and reproductive mates. Something is going to slow it down within the environment. That's the logistic model. And mathematically, the exponential model and the logistic model are shown here. And what is being factored in that's different in the logistic growth rate, you can see there in green, is K. K is what's called, it's also shown with a little dotted line on that graph on the lower right. K is the carrying capacity. It's the conceptual idea of there is some upper limit to that population, and when that population of whatever species it is gets close to that limit, it could be resources or density of that population itself. Like I've said before, mates, something becomes limiting, and there's not enough of it for the population to keep growing at that really fast exponential rate. And it's the population growth rate shown by that equation slows down until it kind of just comes in line with K, that carrying capacity. If you think about all the discussion there's been about population of humans on Earth, there's been talk for over 150 years about is there too many people? How big can the human population get? And then a little more recently, in the last maybe 100 years or so, are we at carrying capacity? If we approach that, Is the human population now hitting carrying capacity? There's so many people, not enough resources, too much pollution, that it will slow down and start to level off at some kind of more stable population growth rate. Again, these graphs are population size over time, so they're showing you the rate of population change. This is very similar to the last slide, just a little cleaned up and showing you a hypothetical population size, which would be the maximum of K, which would be 1500, and putting some numbers into these equations to give you an idea of how they're used. The number of elephants in Kruger National Park in South Africa and that population change is an example of the exponential growth. Um, the numbers were kept below 7,000 for quite a few decades, and it was thought at the time back in the 1950s that the population carrying capacity of that national park area was about 7,000, and they were culled and kept. The population was kept in the national park to about 7,000 beginning in 1967. But then there was seen some more and more damage to the canopy, so they actually stopped doing that, and the populations now have gone up and up and up. It apparently 7,000 elephants was not K or carrying capacity as was thought, and more are continuing to grow. There is some habitat destruction, but I think now they have upwards of 15 to 17,000 individuals. So again, the logistic model incorporates the concept of K or carrying capacity, which is the maximum stable population size of that for a particular environment. So the resources that can support the maximum number of individuals of that species. Some of the evidence that came to support this idea of a logistic growth curve came from some unicellular organisms like these paramecium that grown in vitro, so in like beakers in a lab. It was seen that as the resources, space and nutrients became limiting, these paramecium population sizes leveled out. That's the red and the blue, both of these different species of paramecium. Their population exhibited the same type of logistic growth curve. It increased at first and then leveled out as resources, space, and nutrients became limiting. The life history of a particular species is important to understand. The logistic population growth model is the populations that would exhibit that type of growth would be K selected, the type of species that are sensitive to carrying capacity, which is K. So some species live and reproduce and are sensitive to the density of their own population. So their growth rate will slow down as the population size gets close to K. The other type of life history, so just the way that the organisms live, different species have different life cycles and histories, would be the R selected species. Those are the organisms that exhibit really high rates of reproduction, and they occur in variable environments, not so stable, and the population's densities fluctuate, but they're well below K, so they're not sensitive to resource limitation. So populations that are in environments like, let's say, like a pond, think of the Midwest or somewhere where it gets really cold and the pond kind of goes dormant, nutrients and sediments settle down, and it's all very cold, and there's not a lot of movement of the nutrients inside that pond. It's very stable and stratified. Then spring comes and you get warm air warming the top layer, and the breezes will mix the top and the bottom layer, and you get a lot of nutrient upwelling. Same thing can happen in the oceans too. So what you're getting are lots of nutrients added to the system, and then you have lots of, think of aquatic unicellular organisms like the paramecium, where there's unlimited amounts of resources for a while. So those tend to be R-selected species, species that have fast life cycles. They're usually small and they reproduce very quickly, and they are not exhibiting population growth in a way that's sensitive to K. They're not feeling the limits of resources. So they're called R-selected species. A lot of weeds are like that, to plants on land. The weedy species grow really quick. They don't really run out of resources. They just kind of grow fast and the populations get as big, and other things might limit them, like just seasons or their life cycle ends before the nutrients or water runs out. So those are our selected species. They're different types of population growth according to the species and some of their genetics. To reiterate, K-selected species are not good colonizers. They're not the first things that come to a site that somehow is open for colonization. They're slow maturing. Think of animals, bigger animals. Um, Long-lived are K-selected species. They don't have they have relatively low rates of reproduction or fecundity. Lots of investment in care for the young. Think of humans, elephants, things that care for their young for a long time. They're specialized and they're good competitors. So these are things that if you took a human and dumped them in like on a new lava flow that had cooled in Hawaii, they wouldn't survive. We need lots of resources, lots of food to let us grow and mature and reproduce. They're not the first colonizers of new sites. That would be little plants of seeds that blew in. They can grow in the cracks and don't need a lot of moisture. Those would be the R-selected species that would come colonize that site first in the successional process. Our selected species are good colonizers. They reach their sexual maturity rapidly. Think of weeds again, mustard or poppies, things that they come in and they just take off, and they produce their seeds. They do their full reproductive cycle within a few months. Short-lived, high growth rate, high reproduction or fecundity. They do not have much investment in care for the young, generalists, and poor competitors. So when thinking about restoring a particular site and you're thinking about these population dynamics and growth rates and what's important for the species you're trying to restore or protect, you can ask some of these questions like, why do all populations eventually stop growing? What environmental factors stop a population from growing? That gets into some really good stuff that you could use in restoration design. And the first step to answering these is to examine the effects of increased population density. What are the things that actually are related to K? Some of the things that make up K, or the carrying capacity, these are density dependent factors. As the population gets more and more dense, these are factors that make that species respond to K. Like, okay, there's too many of the organisms. There could be limiting resources, not as much food and shelter, or that organism produces some kind of toxic waste, toxic to itself, or diseases become more prevalent, more predation, more stress, more emigration, individuals leaving. All of those things will be the thing that creates that sensitivity to K for that population. Yeasts are a great example of waste accumulation and how that affects their population, and that's discussed in the next slide. So as a population gets more and more dense, the numbers get higher. All living organisms produce waste. Sometimes that waste can accumulate to the level as it starts to hinder or slow the growth rate. In wine, as yeast populations increase, they make more alcohol during fermentation. But guess what? Just like with humans, too much alcohol, the yeast can that's a waste product, and it can make it too alcoholic, approximately above 13% of that percentage of their own habitat will be lethal. So it starts to kill them off. It's kind of a natural way that populations adjust themselves so things don't get too out of whack. Disease also increases, not amongst yeast, but other populations. Some would have considered that the COVID-19 pandemic was partially a density dependent thing. And also, density is an interesting subject with humans because although you look at the Black Plague, that was definitely density dependent spread of the pathogen because people were living in such close proximity, and there were close proximity to rats that carried the plague and spread it through fleas. But also now we have such mass, easy transfer of goods and services and even humans all over the globe. So there's a lot of connectivity, and it kind of increases, even though humans are pretty dense on the planet. The travel and transportation is so advanced that things can spread very rapidly, not just because of density dependence, but because of our interconnectivity too. Daphne are a really neat little aquatic organism that show seasonal fluctuations in their population sizes due to temperature. And the temperature is kind of like our pond example. It increases nutrient availability, which makes these Daphnia populations grow pretty big, pretty quick, and then drop off when it gets cooler and nutrients availability goes away in the winter months. There's also some organisms that are closely related to Daphnia that have a storage organ in them, and they store starches. So their populations can actually go after the resources are used up during any given period of time, like a season. The Daphnia continue to grow, and the population keeps growing for a while after that because they're now not feeding on the nutrients in the aquatic environment because they've been used up. They're using their storage organ to continue to grow. So they go past what would be considered their carrying capacity, or K. They go past their maximum population size, and then when all the nutrients are gone and their storage is gone, that whole population crashes. So it exhibits these really drastic fluctuations as you see in these graphs. There are also density independent factors. So population growth changes that are not dependent upon the size or the density of the species. Severe storms, floods, unpredictable cold spells or hot spells, I would add earthquakes, volcanoes, meteorite impacts. All these things are really what we call stochastic or unpredictable, kind of random events. So the population doesn't respond and change. It's just dramatically affected by these, and they're not related to the size of the population. Why they occur or not, they're unrelated. An example of a density independent population are these double crested cormorants on Lake Huron in the Great Lakes. And the drop in active nests during the mid 1990s was due to these big storms, unpredictable disturbances, with some birds then ending up not nesting. So that would be an effect of this disturbance on the population that is not related to the density or size of that population. There you go. There are some of the basics of population dynamics.